This video is looking at language analysis and it's using two extracts from the novel Dracula. Okay, so to do this you'll need a copy of the extracts printed out with you so you can annotate and start to put your notes and ideas on them. And as ever, when you first approach an extract, you really need to read it through and visualise what's going on within the action of that narrative, within that text. So as you read it, try and imagine how you would film it if you were a director. Say, what would be in shot, what would be on your screen at all points. So reading this along with me. I was not alone. The room was the same, unchanged in any way since I came into it. I could see along the floor in the brilliant moonlight my own footsteps marked where I had disturbed the long accumulation of dust. In the moonlight opposite me were three young women, ladies by their dress and manner. I thought at the time that I must be dreaming when I saw them, though the moonlight was behind them, they threw no shadow on the floor. They came close to me and looked at me for some time and then whispered together. Two were dark and had high aquiline noses like the Count, and great dark piercing eyes that seemed to be almost red when contrasted with the pale yellow moon. The other was fair as can be, with great wavy masses of golden hair and eyes like pale sapphires. I seemed somehow to know her face, and to know it in connection with some dreamy fear, but I could not recollect at the moment how or where. All three had brilliant white teeth that shone like pearls against the ruby of their voluptuous lips. There was something about them that made me uneasy, some longing and at the same time some deadly fear. I felt in my heart a wicked, burning desire that they would kiss me with those red lips. Okay, so looking at that, first of all, try and work out exactly what's going on in that extract. Be happy with everything that the narrator is saying, what he's focusing on, what is really going on. So from the moment you have that realisation, in the first line, I was not alone, thinking about the dust on the floor, thinking about the moonlight, thinking about the idea that these women are very well dressed but they have no shadows, and then examining each of them in turn and then returning to the narrator's feel of unease about them. At this point, if there are any words that you don't know or you don't understand, if you've got chance, now's a good time to look them up. Obviously you can't do that in an examination or an assessment, but in terms of expanding your vocabulary and getting some range on board, that is a really good idea, just to start looking up those words. Then if the next time round you make sure you've got a pen and anything that strikes you as worthy of comment. So you're not, at this point, you're not necessarily looking to say, oh look, here's a simile, here's a metaphor. You are looking for something that you think there's something to say about this particular section, even if you don't quite know why. So looking through this, I would say first of all, this idea of I was not alone, standing out by itself, it's that kind of idea. And also just to recognise that we're talking in the first person. I think that's probably worthy of comment. And we've got another one there. Oh, and another one. I think I might put a wiggly line under there. You might have to look that up so you know what it means. Looking, it came close to me, whispered together. Whisper's a good word. It's generally onomatopoeic. Two were dark like the Count, great dark piercing eyes. I know that eyes are a Gothic trope, so I'm going to underline that. Red is a good Gothic colour. You've got this idea of contrast. Yellow moon, and then this fairness, these golden, this golden hair, eyes like pale sapphires. I'm zone in on the fact that that is a simile, but then this kind of concept needs more attention, and this kind of feeling of unease I'm going to just mark in there. So I'm trying to kind of get patterns out of it. I'm aware as well that there's this idea of dream in there. So looking at ideas of how language is being used, I'm starting to pick out things to think about. Next section, obviously we've gone up to here anyway on the previous page. Dreamy fear is a strange concept. Going to do that. Shone like pearls. Ruby. Voluptuous is a good word. And that probably kind of deserves comment. I think we've got 2 mention of lips here. Deadly fear. I'm just thinking about what could possibly be said when we get to the kind of developing the detail. Now this next step is really important, because too often people don't include the right level of detail in their work, and generally when you get to GCSE and A-level, the exam boards comment that candidates who annotate in detail the extracts that they're given tend to do way better than those who don't. So it's worth spending that time really trying to develop your ideas a little bit. So this is going through on everything at the moment. I'm going to imagine my question is, how does the writer use language effectively in this passage? And the reason I'm going to do that is because it then gives me the chance to comment on anything that I see, rather than limiting it to how does the writer present the women, or how does the writer present the narrator's unease through language. So everything is fair game here. So looking at the opening, we zoned in on the fact that it was going to be in first person and not alone. The idea that line is actually on its own. It's blunt, direct. It shows the speed of his realisation. The first person account is going to make it personal, intimate, allow access to narrator's thoughts, putting the idea of internal monologue there as well. So the minute you see that kind of eye, just be thinking, how is that going to impact upon your reading of the passage? So the room was the same, unchanged in any way since I came into it. I could see along the floor in the brilliant moonlight my own footsteps marked where I had disturbed the long accumulation of dust. So here you've generally got the creation of tension. There's a description. And you follow, and we know that narrator is called Jonathan Harker, so I'll just say we follow Harker's I guess what trying to think of a word for that. Follow Harker's perception, eye line. The idea that you can see it. You get the idea of Stoker is the writer, using a Gothic trope there. The moonlight, the brilliant moonlight. In the moonlight. So really, in terms of this pattern, we picked this out before, that you've got those 3 versions of moonlight. So all of a sudden, repeated reference to moonlight and Gothic trope again creates tension. There's limited light. And you get 3 young women, ladies by their dress and manner. I thought at the time I must be dreaming when I saw them, for though the moonlight was behind them, they threw no shadow on the floor. So there is this kind of moment of revelation. the supernatural. They came close to me and looked at me for some time and then whispered together. We talked about that being onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia, and it's going to mimic the noise of sharing secrets. Two were dark, had high aquiline noses like the Count, and great dark piercing eyes. Now that is another Gothic idea, focus on eyes. Okay, and you've got the red, so the connotations of red within this context, contrasted with the pale yellow moon. That's a kind of, the moon being yellow is unusual itself, and it's another repeated reference to the moon. So the other was fair, and she sounds almost, if you think about golden hair and light blue eyes, and we'll come back to sapphires in a moment, she sounds almost angelic. But we know that she's not an angel, very definitely not an angel. She's a vampire. So there's that contrast, that idea between appearance and reality. That dichotomy. So a dichotomy is a tension. And you could say there is a dichotomy between appearance and reality, the woman's appearance and her reality. We pick up the idea that there is a simile there. They are pale sapphires, so a sapphire is a precious stone. So look at the connotations of that. And the idea that it's pale as well. They're kind of unhealthy, maybe. Delicate. Unusual. I seem somehow to know her face and to know it in connection with some dreamy fear. That is nearly oxymoronic. Normally, fear is not dreamy. And so you've got that sense of confusion created by an oxymoron. I could not recollect how or where, so it's disorientation, which leads to the tension increasing again. All three have brilliant white teeth, so again, kind of connotations. Shone like pearls. Again, you've got this idea of sapphire, pearl, ruby, and it's probably worth, so that's a metaphor. It's probably worth commenting on that, the idea of how these women are presented. We know they're ladies because they are dressed very well, they are very elegant in their behaviour, and they've got this association with precious stones. The word voluptuous is also interesting, and I go for the kind of connotations of voluptuous. Something about them that made me uneasy, longing, and at the same time some deadly fear, so creation of tension. And I would contrast this wicked burning desire maybe with the way, again, this angelic girl looks, that they would kiss me with those red lips. So it ends on this very kind of physical image. There we go. No. I'll just write it again. There we go. Okay, so really one of the ideas that you then go back to is to look then at where there are patterns. So you can start to talk about the repeated use of references to the moon. You can talk about maybe the use of colour in this passage, because there are very strong colours. You could talk about the use of the precious stone imagery. You could talk about the use of imagery generally in terms of the similes and the metaphors. You could talk about the different ways that tension is increased. generally try and group your ideas rather than just going through it chronologically. Try and pick them out into different sections. So rather than saying, everything about precious stones and then having to come back to it after 2 or 3 points, other points, oh, precious stones again, use your annotation to get all of that ordered before you start writing. Okay, so then looking at extract 2, and I will leave you to do that process yourself through it. So reading very, very carefully and going through and looking at the vocabulary that you might want to pick up on. And I think I'm just going to circle some things for you that you will probably want to start commenting on. Okay, so just picking up on some of those bits there. See what you can think, and if you've got any ideas of your own, please do add those in. But have a think about those points that I've circled. What can you maybe start to say about them? One thing you might want to do is you might want to look up the idea of the potential classical reference to Furies. That's a good piece of general knowledge for reading and understanding things generally. You might want to use the word diabolic. It means connected with the devil. Wrath, and it's pronounced wrath, I promise it's pronounced wrath, not wrath, is a deadly sin. So what impact does that have? Think of words that are repeated and why. I think we've also got fury repeated. Think of maybe the kind of actions and the verbs. You might want to think about plosive alliteration there. Plosive alliteration, P's, B's, etc. Can you link it to violence, usually, as the effect? Wolves as a kind of gothic trope. We look at the connotations of lurid. And then look at this use of dialogue here. Are these actual questions or are they rhetorical questions? Look at the exclamations. Look at the idea of the ultimatum. The idea that his voice cuts through the air. Okay, think of what, verb again. Think of what you can there. So try for this one to come up with, say, 4 points, 1 point per paragraph, regarding how the writer, Stoker, remember it's Bram Stoker's Dracula, uses language effectively in this passage. And you can talk about things like repetition, you can talk about things like diabolic imagery, you can talk about the connotations of the verbs used, you can talk about exclamation, question, use of dialogue, plosive alliteration, anything else that also I suppose it occurs to you, I've just noticed up here, as if lapped in a storm of fury. So think about that image maybe, that simile, and what it's actually saying, as if he was, kind of being consumed by this angry storm. Really strong use of language there. Try and break it down into why it's effective. Okay, so when you've got your detailed annotation, you then need to make sure that you're writing it up well. And it's one thing having kind of a beautifully scribbled on, maybe multicoloured load of annotated notes, but you've actually got to put those into good analytical paragraphs. So lots of schools use acronyms like PETAL or PEE or PEA or so, and generally they all boil down to remind us to do the following 3 points. And it doesn't matter which framework you're using, you're basically trying to follow something to get this information in. So somewhere in that paragraph, you must have a view, an argument, or an interpretation. The writer portrays X as Y, or you could have the writer uses metaphors to create a sense of, or the writer uses repetition to escalate tension, or anything like that that's going to be a kind of core point, what you're going to demonstrate within this paragraph. Somewhere in the paragraph, you have to have and give the evidence for that. And the evidence is generally either going to be quotations or direct references. A quotation should be short and embedded, so it should become part of your own sentence rather than just being stuck at the front of a sentence and then kind of explained. It should kind of blend into your own writing. Direct references are useful where you're trying to show repeated extracts of things. Or examples of things rather. So you obviously it's difficult, if you start talking about lists, or if you start talking about repetition, or if you start talking about many different things, you've got to be specific enough that your reader knows the exact part of the text that you're talking about, that it's not fuzzy at all. You're definitely kind of pointing out why you're saying what you're saying with some precision. And then thirdly, you've got to make sure that your paragraph is developed beyond that first claim. So that's where you're maybe going to talk about the connotations of things, the symbolism of things, the use of contrast, anything that kind of just goes into that additional detail to help you prove that there is an escalation of tension, or that there is a use of diabolical imagery and it's effective because, or the repeated references to the moonlight have the effect of. Whatever order you decide to put those in, as long as you've got the elements in that paragraph, then that will serve you well. If you're just starting out with writing analytical paragraphs, it may be that something like PETAL, so point, evidence, theme, analysis, link, or PEA, point, evidence, analysis, is a good kind of checklist for getting you started. But think of it as kind of stabilisers when you're riding a bike. The better you get at riding the bike, the less you need the stabilisers. The stabilisers come off and you ride independently. Your essays, as you get better, will ultimately be quite formulaic, quite dull, if you're just bashing through PEA paragraphs in a very kind of precise, I'm going to put this here, and this here way. It's better to try and write independently. But keep in mind, look, these are the 3 things that my paragraph's trying to do at all points. Okay, so I hope that's helped. Have a go at writing those up, and if you have any questions, let me know.